Gresham College presents The Making of a Masterpiece, Remember Me, by Professor Christopher Hogwood.
Good afternoon and welcome and congratulations to all of us, including me, for remembering it was a Monday this week and not a Tuesday as usual, so well done. This is the last lecture of this year, the last lecture before Christmas, and it takes the form a little bit of the musical equivalent of one of those trips to the zoo with your grandmother or great aunt and so on, where you were taken and paraded past all these cages to have the slight differences between species explained to you, and you looked at the quadrupeds and you identified this variety of marsupial and this other. I thought the same technique might work for a sort of show and tell of certain techniques in musical composition that lie behind quite a number of masterpieces, the overriding title of this whole season's lectures. And the two devices that we want to parade past are very simple. One is the round, or the canon. Everybody at some time, I think, has sung Three Blind Mice, so you know the round or the canon. Somebody starts, and then the next voice follows at a fixed interval, and then after that. The other device, which curiously is very often connected with the round, is that of having supporting harmonies, a bass line, repeating itself, sometimes very simply, sometimes quite complicated, a series of harmonies, a moving bass which lies underneath this piece. Dealing with the two together for various reasons, one being that the earliest piece we have of notated polyphonic music in this country actually employs both these devices. It's not seasonal to sing Summer is a-Comin' In, but it has these devices. You'll notice that it's held up by an ostinato, saying sing cuckoo, sing cuckoo, sing cuckoo, never stops. And over the top, Summer is a-Comin' In, by one voice, followed by another, followed by another. Here it is. That's the first problem with rounds and canons, how to stop them. You might have wondered if it was ever going to come to an end, and in fact there is no notated end. It could go on perpetually. So first problem is how to stop it. A second obvious audible problem is it never moves anywhere harmonically. Because of that repeating bass, it can never get away from that key. It can be used as an advantage sometimes, but it's certainly a defining form when you have a ground bass, that it sticks basically in one tonality, just as it's a definition of the canon that the second voice has to follow the first exactly and the third has to follow. So once you've heard one and remembered that, you recognize it each time it comes up. This whole idea of how you get your bearings in music by hearing something that has been made familiar by the composer. This is the remember me idea. So it's either the repeating bass or the repetition of the canonic part, or both together, that makes things stick readily in the mind. Here's exactly the same technique, of course, used in a piece that has become very popular, more or less at the same time as Vivaldi's Four Seasons became popular. The Pachelbel Canon was first printed, curiously, in 1941 and recorded shortly afterwards, and now, of course, is at the top of most people's hit lists. But you can see exactly the same techniques in use as the summaries are coming in, except the initial bass, the series of harmonies, employs slightly more notes than the two used in summaries are coming in. But the canon is an exact canon, first one violin, then a second violin, and then a third violin. They start playing just in scale-wise, then the rhythm heightens a little bit. They begin to move apparently independent of each other, but everything harmonizes over this repeating bass pattern, and you never once leave the home key. there is a certain compulsion to nod off, and not least for the people who are playing the surrounding harmony, which doesn't change at all. But one improvement on Summaries Are Coming In, Pachelbel did fix an ending for it, so it does not go on forever, and he arranges all the rhythmic intensity in the center of the piece. So you begin slow, gradually wind up, and then gradually wind down. There is a shake to it. Even so, Canon developed just like that would not be a great talking point, certainly not for a whole hour. One has to devise other conditions in which the canon can fit, sometimes almost unnoticed as part of the fabric of the music. Some of the most, I think, ingenious canons come in Bach's Goldberg variations. You remember that Bach wrote these for Goldberg to play to his aristocratic employer, not, as program notes often tell you, in order to send him to sleep, like the Pachelbel canon, but in fact to entertain him because he suffered from insomnia and wanted something to occupy his mind in the hours when he was awake. And the arrangement of the set of 30 variations that Bach devised is quite ingenious, in that every third variation he made as a canon. That is, although the harmonic scheme of each variation is taken directly from the aria at the beginning of the piece, this is a set of variations based on harmony, not on melody. But the aria that starts the Goldbergs gives you the ground plan of every movement thereafter. It's what the upper parts do, because the upper parts are newly invented, of course, for every variation. And while some are single line, some are slow, some are fast, some are toccatas, some are dance forms, some are jigs, the canons, mostly held in the right hand, are arranged with great ingenuity, because the first canon is written at the unison. That is exactly like Three Blind Mice. The second voice comes in singing Three Blind Mice at the same pitch as the person before. Three blind mice, three blind mice. The next one comes in, three blind mice. That works for one canon. The next canon that comes up, 3 variations later, Bach has just shifted the interval, so the next voice comes in 1 note higher. So instead of 3 blind mice, the next one comes in 3 blind mice. And he can do that with the following canon, 3 blind mice, and so on. The interval gets bigger and bigger, so although the parts exactly follow each other, they're just bodily moved, 1 tone higher, 2 notes higher, 3 notes higher, and so on. And one other trick you can use with a canon, which we'll hear when we come to the 5th canon. We'll play little snippets of these in a moment, so you can hear that in the 5th canon, he thinks, now people know I'm going to start here, and the entry will come there, and it will go along in parallel. No, what he does is, as it were, put a mirror to the canon. And that is, it's the reflected image. The second voice is the opposite way round. The canon begins ti-da-da-da-dee-dum, going downwards, and the answer comes at the 5th, because this is the 5th canon, but it goes upwards. Ti-da-da-da-da-dum. Let's just hear these little ones, and you'll catch the beginnings of each canon and see what I'm talking about. Here we are. Second voice. And then the next canon that you come to, the second voice comes in 1 tone higher than the first voice. It almost sounds like free composition. You're not aware of the canon. Similarly, at the canon at the 3rd. And now just a sample of the canon at the fifth. We skip on and you hear the descending first voice mirrored. In point of fact, I think the harpsichord is not the easiest instrument on which to hear these sort of contrapuntal things. It's a bit sacrilegious to say so, since Bach devoted so much of his harpsichord repertoire to counterpoint. But in many instances, I think it's easier for listeners to hear the distinct parts moving when they are played by different instruments. So here's that same canon. Maybe this will sound a little, certainly it's in a slightly different tonality, but you'll hear three stringed instruments, and there it's probably easier to disentangle, and you can hear the one string part going down and then the violin going upwards. I think it is slightly easier on the ear to hear the separate parts when it's separate instruments. But the construction, although it is extremely technically ingenious, does have that redeeming feature of all masterpieces. It sounds completely natural, and the same goes for all the canonic variations in the Goldbergs. Bach was a master of this. We tend to think of these sort of techniques as being the purview of the Baroque period in particular, when technical counterpoint was very much prized. But it's not exclusive. Amongst 19th century composers, I guess it's Brahms who is the person who most admired earlier techniques and styles. He made a great collection of earlier music. He did a lot of editing of early music. You almost feel he felt he was born into the wrong century. He would have loved to have been a Baroque composer. And amongst his collected snippets of music were examples of ingenious canons from the very earliest Renaissance right through Baroque and classical times. He was obviously fascinated by what could be done with this sort of technique without sort of announcing it to the public. And just to add to his own collection, he composed for ladies' choir a set of canons which, unless you're told they're canons, I think probably the fact that two ladies' voices starting are answered almost immediately by two soprano voices starting, answered by two altos underneath, following exactly along. It sounds like a freely composed piece of music, but in fact it is strict canon all the way through. Here's one of the set. He in fact wrote a dozen pieces just to show that canon could be used, as it were, unobtrusively. They're all of them nice little pieces. They're all very ingeniously constructed, but as you can hear, they have the same problem that Summaries Coming In had and Pachelbel had, that they can't get very far away from the starting key. And so you're limited by the range of the canon and its answer. And so essentially, each example of canonic writing will be quite short. That was written about 1860, 1859 or so. Just slightly earlier than this, there was a very ingenious canon in the last movement of César Franck's Violin Sonata. This was a sonata that had taken a long time coming because it started because Wagner's wife, Cosima Wagner, wanted a violin sonata from César Franck. He never got round to it. And in the end, he was pushed into it by the violinist Isai, who asked him, please, could he write a violin sonata as a wedding present for Isai? And this was therefore rather forced on César Franck by the wedding date. And he did manage it. The premiere took place in an art gallery in Brussels, and somebody had forgotten to turn the lights on, so the reputation of the first performance was that Isai ended up playing most of it from memory. Well, that was a wedding present. The last movement is, though, led by the piano, followed exactly by the violin. It does manage to give occasionally the feeling that it can escape from these bounds, but it's quite a long chunk of strictly canonic writing before the two instruments become freed from each other and can go their independent ways. Then they're freed at last. It's a very extended piece of writing with quite a few changes built into it. Ingenious, and it comes again at the end of that movement, but that's definitely a nod towards Baroque techniques. Canon goes on being used. You probably remember, if you listen to the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, there's a wonderful canon in the third movement of that, where the winds follow each other for an enormous length of time. Clashing occasionally, but basically the second part copying exactly the first part. It's an inescapable part of a composer's technique, and it's one of the early lessons you learn in writing counterpoint, how to write a two-part, a three-part, a four-part canon. You also have a series from the Renaissance of puzzle canons. If anybody is interested in cryptography and crossword puzzles, these are available for solving still, because they would write the canon out, 7, 8, 9, 10 bars, but without indicating what sort of canon it was. And so you were left to discover, is it a simple Three Blind Mice canon, or is it a canon where the next voice comes in at a different interval? Or is it possible that it works with the second and third voices coming in upside down? Or another variant with some canons is that the second voice comes in singing notes twice as long as the first voice, i.e. the slow motion version of the canonic thing. And we're sure that these canons worked because the composers assure us that they are canons. But there's quite a collection of still unsolved canons where even clever computer technology has not managed to find which of the thousands or millions of variants is the actual solution that would make the canon work, and whether it's a canon in 2 parts or 3 parts or 4 parts or what have you. So anybody feeling ingenious and with a spare Christmas to puzzle over these things, there are all these canons asking to be solved. Let's now leave the canon on one side for a moment and go back to the other features of the Pachelbel and the summaries are coming in, which is that the canons were running over a repeating bass pattern. This is another very easy way of the audience immediately acquiring solidarity and assurance. You hear the chaconne bass or the ground bass, whichever name you want to give it, the ostinato bass, the bass that is obstinate and keeps coming back, never moving from a series of notes, or usually a series of harmonies attached to these notes. And that gives you the ground plan of many pieces of music from Baroque, from classical, from even up to the present day, composers writing Passacaglias, chaconnes, ground basses. It's another technical challenge, but half the challenge is to, of course, make you not so aware of the fact that there is this fixed patterning on the bass line. It's also a very useful operatic device. Many Baroque operas would end with a chaconne or a canon after much mobility in your evening in the opera house. It was nice to feel you'd come home at the end to something that was absolutely stable, and when you'd heard this bass pattern repeated 3, 4, 5 times, you knew everything had been resolved and you were on safe ground. One of the very early experiments with this sort of form is Monteverdi, and I thought it'd be nice to listen to part of the Zeffiro Torna, one of the madrigals he wrote, over a very simple little syncopated bass. It only has 4 notes in it. 1 and 2, 3, 4, ta-dum, pom, 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 pom. It's just a 2-bar pattern. It repeats, I've never actually counted it, I would say 100 times at least. Over it comes, though, this wonderful poem of the soft south wind blowing and the sound of the lovers' voices. It's set for 2 tenors who, in a way, imitate each other. This is an example, not of strict canon, but of something that is canonic sometimes. And these voices sing of the sounds being replicated. The echo comes back from the mountains, and so the second voice imitates the first voice. It is almost a canonic effect. There's lovely picture painting, because the sound goes up to the top of the mountains and down to the bottom of the valleys, and Monteverdi follows all this. But the gentle swirling and the coloratura of the parts is the mainstay. And you do get lulled, exactly as you do by the insistence of the Pachelbel canon. You sink away into this feeling that everything is very secure and the wind is blowing and everything is fine in the world, and then suddenly it stops. And the whole thing just shifts up a tone, and you realize this is a very shocking moment. You've been lulled into this one set of harmonies. And the text says, "But I am not in love. I'm wandering alone in the forest." The joy of having 2 tenors is not only Monteverdi can trick you once with this thing, the second tenor that can then do the same thing, and you get this miraculous move of tonal center as you shift into a completely new territory, new key, you've lost the bass, everything, all the whole reassurance mechanism has gone. And it's a beautiful picture. This is a very early recording, I should warn you before you hear it. It was made in 1937 by Nadia Boulanger, who started a lot of the research into Monteverdi before the last war, and centered in Paris with her own team of singers. On this recording, she's playing the piano. That dates it for you. There was not harpsichord continua. Some cellist, we don't know who, played underneath, but the 2 tenors are Hugh Queneau and Paul Deraine. It's a slightly querulous tenor sound, but it's interesting because of Hugh Queneau, the Swiss tenor, because he had, I think, the world's longest ever known career as a performing singer. because he gave his first concert in 1928. He made his debut at the Metropolitan in New York when he was 85. He sang about 450 performances in Glyndebourne, so it's very possible that everybody here has heard him in one form or another. He very nicely said that because his voice was a very meagre voice to begin with, it didn't really make much difference getting old. Nobody noticed any deterioration. And he certainly did get old, because he announced himself happily as a newlywed at the age of 105. Swiss laws had changed, and so he took out a civil partnership with his partner. And he actually died last December at the age of 108. So that is some delicious career. So here is Zeffiro Torna in 1937 with Queno and Paul de Rennes.
abbandonate sole. L'ardor Dido e meglio di abbandonate sole.
It's a wonderful shock. I forgot to mention there's that little false alarm that you hear in the middle where it seems to stop and then goes on with the endless ground bass more than 100 times. That was nothing to do with Monteverdi. That was just the length of a 78 recording where they had to stop and turn it over, and they weren't able to patch it so that it sounds as though it was completely continuous. But I think you do the repetitiveness of the bass is not mirrored in what the voices do over the top. And I think the skill of the greatest contrapuntalists in the Baroque time, Monteverdi being one, Purcell being another, who announced and wrote, in fact, in the little Playford guide to writing music, that the business of writing on a ground bass and writing in canonic form was an easy thing. He found it. And the trick with Purcell's writing, and as with Monteverdi's, is to make people hardly aware that there is this necessity of fitting to the repeating bass, and to work the upper parts in a way that Pachelbel hardly tried to do in his canon. Purcell is trying to constantly give you the feeling that this is a work of several movements in distinct meters, some slow, some fast, and going even into a variety of keys. Every part in the top three parts, this is a piece with 3 violins like the Pachelbel, and a repeated bass with the same number of notes as the Pachelbel canon. But like Pachelbel, nearly all the top parts are somewhere or other derived from each other. It's not a canon from the very beginning, but it is canonic. And it shows Purcell's skill, I think, in mixing the two together. Sometimes there are 3 voices all saying the same thing. Sometimes it's block harmony, sometimes it's 2 against 1. And never, I think, are you aware of the constant measure of that bass line that could be splitting it into very obvious chapters if you were not careful. You get some idea from that, I think, of the different techniques Purcell has for avoiding the routine and the rock. Also, the ingenuity, I think, of having the unadorned bass line not showing at the beginning, but showing in the middle. Suddenly everybody stops and you just hear the continuo, the lute and the bass playing along. He reserves for that in case you hadn't noticed it was a ground bass. Up to that point, there is nothing but the ground bass. And then you realize that everything you've been listening so far, which you thought was a multi-section Baroque sonata maybe, was in fact over this inflexible ostinato. It's because of techniques like that, I think, that when we come to Dido and Aeneas, the farewell of Dido over a chromatic ground bass never feels as though that repeating pattern is in any way getting in the way of the distribution of words and music above. When you only have one voice, of course, there's no question of canon. So this is purely an example of how to exploit the harmonies possible from a chromatic bass. Most of these chaconne basses had certain connotations. You have quite a jolly one like the Monteverdi. You have quite a normal hymn tune sequence of harmonies like that last Purcell. But you had this descending chromatics going down a fourth from dee da 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 dee dom, from the tonic to the dominant in the scale, hitting each chromatic, which was the hallmark of a lament. There are many, many uses of this chaconne bass, and everybody knows the minute it starts, before Dido opens her mouth, you know that this is the end. She is lamenting. This is the traditional shorthand for saying end of opera, end of heroine. And the ingenuity, though, is that having announced the bass at the beginning, pathetically, we all know it's a lament, it's then just watch the way that Purcell uses not only the music, but even the words to get you over this bump where the bass has finished and comes back to the beginning again, the repetitiousness. And he does it not only by casting the musical line as a bridge over these joints, but also just using the words. When I am laid in earth, may my wrongs create no trouble. And may my wrongs create, this unfinished sentence, is very neatly placed at the end of the chromatic pattern. So you know that the sense is not going to stop. And you follow, in fact, the grammar as well as the music, and you are not at all aware of the fact that the bass line is repeating on itself. That's one ingenuity. A second ingenuity is just the simplicity of a line like "Remember me" on a single note, which is very beautiful. And unlike Monteverdi, who uses a good trick twice in Zefiro with the two tenors, Purcell doesn't repeat his "Remember me." The second time it comes round, you get a top note. It's the only high note, really, in the whole piece, and it marks a point. And again, you realize when you hear that top note, you have no idea whereabouts you are in the sequence of repeating bass lines. And when Dido gets to the end, the lament bass does not finish. It goes on with some of the most extraordinary harmonies. If you think that a set pattern of bass notes requires a predictable series of harmonies, or that you might have heard every possible harmonization in the course of the lament, then you have to think again, because just at the end, as the epilogue, before it goes into the final chorus, Purcell gives you all the other harmonies he could have used but didn't use in the course of the lament.
May my wrongs
It's a moot point, I think, whether you remember me for its bass line or for its harmonies or for its single melodic line. But in general, I think, with the later chaconnes and passacaglias, one remembers them for their sequences of harmony. You read the progressions as harmonic progressions rather than a bass line progression. Two little tiny epilogue pieces just to show you that in practice. One, an advertisement for the last lecture we shall have this season, when we shall be dealing with Bach unaccompanied violin music and unaccompanied violin music in general, and we'll be talking in detail about the Bach chaconne for solo violin, which begins with a bass line. I'm not sure. It certainly begins with a series of harmonies which are very memorable. Ultimate in reducing the interest of the bass and increasing the interest of the harmony, I think, is this last little sample, which is the last movement of Brahms' Fourth Symphony, which is a Passacaglia, and it's very much taken from models that Brahms had collected from Bach's cantatas. But you'll notice in the introductory chords that the orchestra gives out, the bass stays exactly the same. There's 7 different harmonies, and the bass is exactly the same until the very last one. It just dimps, so it's tonic, 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 dominant, and back to the tonic again. You would have thought that's a rather unprepossessing sort of bass on which to model an entire, quite a substantial movement. But you'll see almost immediately he takes the implications of the harmony as the reiterated ostinato, not the fact that it was a monotonic bass. Here's just the opening to remind us. And so on for 10 minutes. It still is strictly chaconne, Passacaglia, all the way through. That's really the end of the little zoo tour, but there are many more animals that could be presented in this guise. I think it is interesting that the very first Summerse coming in gave us most of the material from which you can extrapolate these other devices, be it Monteverdi, Brahms, Purcell, Handel, César Franck, or any of the others. And we can have more examples of these techniques, I think, in the next 2 or 3 lectures, extracted from live performances of things like Mozart, oboe quartet, the first of the published Beethoven string quartets, opus 18, and then, as I said, the last lecture of the series will be with Pavlo Beznoziuk and looking at what a solo violin can do in terms of technical attributes of a masterpiece. Meanwhile, happy Christmas, and any questions you have are very welcome.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.